The Black Ledger, War History Episode 1, The Migration of Supremacy. Victorious warriors win first and then go to war, while defeated warriors go to war first and then seek to win. 1. Context lock. When violence became routine. Before there were names, there was scarcity. What was scarce was not gold, not land. It was reach, protection, coordination. Violence was always possible. One body against another. Strength against strength. That was never the question. The question was whether violence could be survived when it returned. Imagine a small settlement near a river bend. Mud huts, stored grain. Families bound by proximity more than loyalty. The first attack is sudden. A neighboring group crosses the fields at dawn. There is shouting. There is confusion. Someone is killed. Someone runs. The attackers take what they can carry and leave. The survivors bury their dead and repair what they can. They believe the danger has passed. Weeks later, the attackers return. This time, the strongest man steps forward. He fights well. He wounds too. He is overwhelmed and dragged down. The settlement survives again, but fewer remain. By the third attack, something changes. They do not wait for the strongest man. They do not wait for courage. They place watchers at the edge of the fields. They stack sharpened poles near the paths of approach. They agree on a signal. They agree on where to stand. None of this requires brilliance. It requires repetition. Violence becomes war when it can be repeated, when it can be organized, when the same solution can be applied again and again by people who do not know one another personally and do not need to. Early conflict was defined by limitation. Men moved slowly. Information moved slower. Supplies barely moved at all. There were no reserves, no relief forces, no second chances after exhaustion set in. A single fight could be survived. A season of fighting could not. What failed, repeatedly, was the individual. The strongest man could be surrounded. The bravest fighter could be worn down. The hero without support died first, and was replaced by another hero who died the same way. What mattered was not how hard one could strike, but whether that strike could be delivered on demand. Whether others would be present when it mattered. Whether fear would be shared instead of borne alone. Over time, the settlement stops reacting and starts preparing. They post guards even when nothing happens. They rotate watch so exhaustion does not decide outcomes. They punish those who abandon the line. This is not ambition. It is pressure. Pressure from neighbors who learned the same lesson. Pressure from harvests that must be defended every year, not once. Pressure from boundaries that exist only if they are enforced. Technology does not invent war. Technology converts strength into system. A system allows coordination without trust. It allows endurance without heroism. It allows violence to become predictable. Once strength becomes system, war stops being personal. It becomes something that can be planned for, prepared for, and remembered. That is the moment the ledger opens. This entry does not record heroes. It does not record victories. It does not record defeats. It records pressure. 2. The dominant system, the wall that held. The first stable solution to organized violence had 3 parts: the spear, the shield, the massed formation. Reach defeated fists. A wall of points defeated a rush of bodies. Formation defeated individuals every time. This was not speed, it was not surprise, it was control. Citizen infantry stood shoulder to shoulder. Light armor, tight spacing. Each man's shield overlapping the next. Each man's spear extending the reach of the one beside him. No one advanced alone. No one retreated without consequence. The formation did not charge. It walked. It held. It pressed. The power of this system was not in how it struck, but in how it endured. Fear was distributed across the line. Fatigue was shared. Panic had nowhere to go. In the riverlands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, this system took shape. Flat ground, canals, fields that could feed a city or starve it. This was terrain that rewarded cohesion and punished disorder. Sumer, Akkad, city against city, border against border. Between Lagash and Umma, separated by less than 20 miles, the same dispute repeated for generations. Land, water. The Guedin Plain. Who would work it? Who would drink from it? A king of Kish once attempted to impose order, Misilim. He raised boundary stones in the earth, marked the line, a third party, an arbiter. The border was set. It did not hold. Umma crossed the line, diverted the boundary canal, moved into land the stones had marked for Lagash. This was not ambition in the abstract. It was harvest, it was thirst, it was survival. Lagash did not send a champion to resolve the matter. It sent a formation. Spearmen in depth, shield bearers in front, commanders placed where the line would bend, not break. Imagine the moment of contact. No duel, no rush. Just two bodies of men approaching, one organized, one less so. The shields meet, the spears extend, the line does not collapse. The side that cannot maintain cohesion begins to give ground, not all at once. One step, then another. The man who breaks the line does not die first, he dies last, when there is no one left to stand beside him. The city that could put men in line, shield to shield, won the day. A ruler of Lagash raised a monument to record the outcome. Eanatum. Around 2475 before the Common Era, we know the stone as the steel of the vultures. On one face, birds carry the severed heads of the defeated. That is where the name comes from. On another, something more important is shown. A commander at the front, a sub-commander behind him, 6 shield bearers guarding the critical points, 24 spearmen arranged in 4 files of 6, not a hero, a structure. This is the first clear visual record we have of war as system, not a charge, a wall. This formation did not win because it was clever. It won because it could be repeated. It could be trained. It could be replaced. It could be enforced by discipline rather than inspiration. This system solved the last war. It dominated flat ground, slow movement, and short distances. It would not solve the next. 3. The disruption, death before contact. The formation carried one assumption, that war begins at collision, that the decisive moment is contact, shield to shield. The wall advances, the wall meets the wall. The wall that holds wins. The bow removed that assumption. Distance entered the ledger. Killing before contact. Striking without exposure. Forcing loss before engagement. Men who had trained to stand in line now stood beneath a rain they could not answer. Arrows fell from beyond spear reach, from a direction no shield could fully cover. The wall that had beaten the fist could not beat the sky. At first, the losses were small. A man struck in the arm, another in the thigh. Someone falls, then stands again. But the formation does not advance as it was trained to. It hesitates. To hold a shield against a man is one kind of courage. To hold it against something you cannot strike is another. The advantage was not only physical, it was psychological. To stand in rank and take wound after wound without striking back forces a new calculation. Every step forward costs blood. Every pause costs morale. Men begin to look sideways instead of forward. The line bends not because it is broken, but because it is uncertain. Morale collapses before bodies. Commanders lose control before lines dissolve. War no longer begins at the moment of contact. It begins when the first arrow is loosed. Along the Nile and the Tigris, states adapted to this new reality. Egypt learned to field bowmen in mass, not hunters, not skirmishers, units. Assyria went further. The bow was not treated as an auxiliary weapon. It was integrated into doctrine. Archers drilled to loose in volley, to advance under cover, to loose again. Distance combined with discipline. In the 9th century before the Common Era, the system expanded outward through repeated campaigns, not through daring, but through repetition. Ashurnasirpal II ruled from 883 to 859 before the Common Era. He appears often in inscriptions, victories listed, cities subdued. He is remembered by name. The ledger records something else. The state that could afford bows at scale, the state that could train men to use them in formation, the state that could manufacture and transport thousands of arrows for a single campaign. Distance is useless without supply. Arrows must be replaced. Bowstrings maintained. Men rested and rotated. This was not the triumph of a weapon. It was the triumph of administration. Ashurnasirpal described falling upon the enemy like a furious arrow. The metaphor survives. The mechanism matters more. The formation had been the answer to the last war. It assumed it would be allowed to close. The bow posed a question it could not answer. What if you are never allowed to reach the enemy? What if loss begins before engagement? What if the cost of advancing is paid before the battle starts? Once that question existed, every formation had to reckon with it. The ledger turned a page. 4. The disruption scales. Supremacy learns to move distance was only the first disruption. Speed multiplied it. Long before the horse-drawn chariot ruled the battlefield, there were wheels in war. In the cities of early Sumer, heavy war carts rumbled across the plains. 4 solid wheels, drawn by oxen, slow, unwieldy. They appear carved into stone at Uruk and Kish, men standing on platforms, armed with spears and axes. Not cavalry, not shock troops. They were moving towers. These carts did not maneuver. They advanced in straight lines. They intimidated. They crushed those who could not get out of the way. On flat ground against unorganized opponents they worked, but they could not turn quickly. They could not withdraw. They could not pursue. They were an extension of the formation, not a disruption of it. What changed was not the wheel, it was the animal. The domestication of the horse and later its selective breeding altered the equation. Horses moved faster than oxen. They tired differently. They could be trained to respond to reins, voice, and pressure. The cart became lighter, 2 wheels instead of 4, spoked instead of solid. The war cart became the chariot. This was not a single invention. It was a convergence. Better wheels, stronger harnessing, composite bows light enough to be used at speed. When these elements came together, supremacy learned to move. The chariot changed not how far force could strike, but how quickly it could be applied. A platform from which to shoot, to move, and to shoot again from somewhere else. This was not simply movement, it was timing. Imagine an infantry formation advancing across open ground. Shields locked, spears forward, cohesion intact. Now imagine dust rising at the horizon, not men. Motion, the sounds arrives first. Hooves, wheels, the sense that the enemy is not where it was a moment ago. A line of chariots bears down on one flank, not to collide, to threaten. The infantry turns, the chariots withdraw. Before the formation can reorient, the chariots reappear elsewhere. Arrows fall. Then distance again. Supremacy detaches from the line. It moves. Shock mattered. But shock alone did not win wars. What mattered was repositioning. Strike where the enemy was weak. Withdraw before resistance solidified. Return before cohesion recovered. For the first time, force could be concentrated and removed faster than infantry could respond. Command changed with it. War had belonged to the man who could keep order while advancing step by step. Now it belonged to the man who could see the field, read momentum, and act faster than the enemy could think. This advantage was recognized quickly. Across the Near East, chariot corps emerged. Egypt organized entire divisions around them. The Hittites built massed chariot formations, heavier and more numerous. The Mitanni specialized in horse training itself, exporting expertise. Mycenaean Greeks adopted chariots for elite warfare and display. During the Shang dynasty, chariots became the core of aristocratic armies. This was not imitation, it was convergence. Wherever terrain allowed speed and states could sustain cost, the chariot appeared. Because the chariot was not just a weapon, it was an economic threshold. Horses required grain and water. They required pasture in peace and supply in war. Wheels broke, harnesses failed. Crews had to train together continuously. A chariot archer who lost his driver was useless. A driver without an archer was exposed. Nothing about this system was forgiving. Only centralized states could sustain it. This is why the chariot did not dominate everywhere. It thrived on plains. It failed in mountains. Supremacy was no longer universal. It was conditional. At Kadesh, on the Orontes River, the chariot system revealed both its power and its limits, around 1274 before the Common Era. The Hittite king Mu'attali concealed his chariot force. The Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses advanced in divisions, stretched along the march. The battle was chaos. Chariots surged, lines broke, counterattacks followed. Both sides recorded triumph. Both sides survived. The ledger does not decide who won. The ledger records what endured. Both states could replace losses. Both could feed horses. Both could return the following year with chariots rebuilt and crews retrained. That endurance mattered more than the field. Ramesses ruled Egypt for decades after, but because the chariot made him invincible, but because the system around it endured. The Nile fed the granaries. The granaries fed the horses fed the chariot arm. The chariot arm protected the borders that made the granaries possible. A closed loop of supremacy. Speed created advantage. Advantage created cost. Cost limited participation. Only states with sufficient resources could fight on these terms. Those without adapted by avoiding open battle, dispersing, or striking where chariots could not follow. The chariot did not make war faster everywhere. It made it unequal. Supremacy now favored those who could organize economies, not just men. And once war crosses that threshold, it does not go back. The ledger records that moment, because the next system will not slow down. It will only demand more. 5. The counter system. Discipline made absolute. Mobility was not the only answer to supremacy at speed. Another system emerged where terrain, cohesion, and discipline could neutralize movement itself. The hoplite panoply, the long spear, the heavy shield, bronze and iron carried by citizens who could afford to stand in the line. This was not the shock of the chariot. It was the refusal to break. Locked shields, controlled advance, collective endurance. The formation did not chase. It did not pursue. It walked. It held. It pressed. Where chariot warfare favored wealth and speed, the phalanx favored commitment. A man in the line could not disengage without exposing the man beside him. His shield protected the man to his left. His own life depended on the man to his right. Cohesion was not encouraged. It was enforced. This system flourished in the Greek world, where geography fractured authority and made standing armies rare. Sparta, Athens, Corinth, the polis. Here, war became a civic institution. The man in the line was not a king's servant. He was the city, standing. Nowhere was this taken further than in Sparta. From childhood, Spartan males were trained not as individuals, but as parts of a whole. Endurance was cultivated. Fear was suppressed. Obedience was drilled. The Spartan phalanx was not merely trained, it was conditioned. Honor in the formation was not where many assume. The rightmost position was the place of honor. It was also the most dangerous. Each man's shield covered his left side. The man on the far right had no shield protecting his exposed flank. He carried risk for the formation. Veterans and the most trusted warriors stood there, not for glory, for stability. This detail mattered, because it reveals what the phalanx truly was, not a mass of equals, a hierarchy of trust. The system was tested repeatedly. In 490 before the Common Era, a Persian force landed at Marathon. Cavalry, archers, an empire built on movement, distance, and scale. Darius sought to punish Athens for defiance. The Athenians could have met the Persians on open ground. They did not. They chose terrain. Marshes narrowed the field. Hills constrained movement. Cavalry could not sweep. The flanks were protected. Cohesion and place aligned. The Greek center was deliberately thin. The wings were reinforced. When the Persians pressed the center, it bent. But it did not break. The wings held. Then they turned inward. Envelopment, not a heroic charge. a systemic squeeze. The Persians broke, not because they lacked courage, but because their system no longer fit the ground beneath their feet. Discipline defeated mobility when terrain allowed discipline to work. 10 years later, the test came again. Thermopylae, a narrow pass, sea on one side, mountain on the other. The Persian army advanced in numbers unmatched: infantry, cavalry, archers. The Spartans did not attempt to defeat the empire. They attempted to hold, shield to shield, spear forward, rotation under pressure. Men stepping back only to be replaced by fresh ranks. For days, the Persian assaults failed, not because the Spartans were invincible, but because the terrain erased the advantages of speed and scale. The past turned war into a math problem the Persians could not solve. Thermopylae did not win the war, but it proved the system, discipline, when aligned with terrain, could halt supremacy itself. This lesson did not die with the classical Greek city-states. It was refined. In Macedon, north of the Greek heartland, a different synthesis emerged. Philip II lengthened the spear into the sarissa, a weapon so long it required 2 hands. Shields shrank. The formation deepened. The Macedonian phalanx was not meant to. It was meant to fix the enemy in place. This was not a return to rigidity. It was an evolution. Because Philip did not rely on the phalanx alone. Light infantry screened the advance, skirmishers disrupted, and on the flanks, cavalry waited. When Alexander inherited the system, he perfected it. The phalanx pinned, the cavalry moved, not chariots, companions. Heavy cavalry striking where the enemy was already engaged, already pressured, already fixed. The silver shields, veterans hardened by decades of campaigning, stood at the core. Not fast, not flexible, unbreakable. The known world fell not to the flanks alone, but to the combination. Discipline held the enemy. Mobility killed him. This was the final form of the phalanx. Not a wall that won wars by itself, but an anchor that allowed others to do the killing. War had moved beyond the city, beyond the citizen. It had become professional, layered, deliberate. Discipline had not replaced speed. It had learned to command it. And that too would be challenged, because the next system would not seek to hold the line at all. It would seek to move around it. 6. Organization as a weapon. The legion. The phalanx was powerful. It was also rigid. One formation, one direction of strength, one doctrine. Break the line, and the advantage broke with it. The next solution was not greater discipline. It was adaptability. Rome did not invent courage. Rome organized it. The early Roman legion was not a single block. It was a system of parts. The manipula formation divided the army into smaller units called maniples. 3 lines, hastati in front, young men, flexible, designed to engage first. Principes behind them, veterans, heavier armor. The main striking force, triarii in reserve, older men, experienced. The last line, each maniple could move independently. Advance, withdraw, wheel, fill a gap. This was not elegance, it was insurance. Later, the manipule evolved into the cohort, roughly 480 men. Large enough to fight on its own, small enough to maneuver. The legion was no longer a wall. It was a lattice. Standardized equipment meant every soldier knew his role. Standardized supply meant commanders knew what each unit could sustain. The Roman Republic did not win because its soldiers were braver. It won because it could field the same kind of force repeatedly and learn. When one formation failed, the next campaign applied the lesson. When one consul fell, another took the field. The institution outlived the man. Rome learned the value of adaptation the hard way. At Carrhae, in 216 before the Common Era, a Roman army was annihilated. Hannibal drew them into a trap. Double envelopment. The legions were compressed so tightly they could not maneuver. Tens of thousands died in a single day. Rome did not collapse. It changed behavior. It avoided decisive battle when the terrain favored the enemy. It adopted delay, attrition, pressure without engagement. Defeat became instruction. That habit would matter when Rome finally met the phalanx head-on. In the early 2nd century before the Common Era, Rome confronted Macedon. Philip V still fielded the descendants of Alexander's army. Long spears, dense ranks, a formation unmatched on flat ground. At Cynocephalae, in 197 before the Common Era, the armies met in broken terrain. Hills, uneven ground, fog. The Macedonian phalanx advanced in sections, not fully formed. Its strength required perfect cohesion. It did not get it. As the phalanx moved over uneven ground, gaps opened between units, not wide at first, wide enough. Roman maniples did not wait for orders to advance as a single body. They moved independently. They flowed into the gaps. Short swords replaced long spears. Shield walls gave way to close combat. The phalanx, unbeatable from the front, could not turn quickly enough to defend its flanks. Once the line fractured, the system failed. Not because the Macedonians lacked courage, because their formation could not adapt to broken ground. Rome won. The lesson was confirmed 2 decades later. At Pydna, in 168 before the Common Era, the Macedonian king Perseus met the Roman general Aemilius Paulus. At first, the phalanx held. Its advance was devastating. The Roman line bent, men fell. Then the ground betrayed the formation. As the phalanx advanced, it crossed uneven terrain. Small breaks formed. Shields lost alignment. Spears angled away from perfect overlap. Roman soldiers did not push the wall. They slipped inside it. Manipular units entered the gaps. Short swords struck at exposed sides. What had been an impenetrable hedge of spear points became isolated clusters of men who could no longer protect one another. The phalanx collapsed in pieces, not all at once. Rome did not defeat the phalanx by matching its discipline. Rome defeated it by refusing to fight it on its own terms. This was the Roman advantage. Not strength, not speed, organization that tolerated disorder. The legion could fight when plans failed, when terrain betrayed assumptions, when formations broke. The phalanx required perfection. Legion required competence. That difference mattered. In the late 2nd and early 1st century before the Common Era, the system was refined further. Gaius Marius appears in the record, not as a lone genius, but as a moment when Rome solved scale. Property requirements were removed. The state armed its soldiers. The state paid them. The soldier carried his own equipment. They were called Marius's mules. March farther, carry more. Depend less on local supply. The eagle became the legion's standard. One symbol, one identity. Lose the eagle and the legion lost its honor. The army was no longer a seasonal militia. It was a professional instrument. Modular formations, replaceable units. When one cohort fell, another filled the space. When one campaign failed, the next applied the lesson. Rome did not win every battle. Rome survived mistakes long enough to adapt. That was its supremacy. Logistics as supremacy. The Roman war machine. Logistics was invisible power. Roads, depots, standard rations, not glory, not courage. Movement. The Roman legion did not arrive on campaign as a mass of fighters waiting to be told what to do. It arrived as a self-contained system. Every legionary carried more than weapons: a shovel, a pick, a saw, a basket. Stakes for a palisade. This was not auxiliary labor. This was doctrine. At the end of every day's march, the legion did not disperse. It built. A ditch was cut. Earth was piled inward. Stakes were driven. Gates were measured and aligned. By nightfall, a fortified camp stood where open ground had been that morning. Not improvised, standardized. The dimensions were known. The streets were laid out in the same pattern every time. Command tents, supply areas, latrines, and watch positions occupied fixed places. A legion could be attacked at night and know exactly where to form, where to reinforce, where to retreat. This was not paranoia. It was habit. Roman armies did not wait for engineers. They were the engineers. When rivers blocked advance, bridges were built. When terrain slowed movement, roads were cut. When cities resisted, siege works rose methodically, not impulsively. Earthworks, ramps, circumvallation, counterwalls. At Elysia, Caesar did not defeat the Gauls with battle alone. He defeated them with 2 rings of fortifications, built by soldiers who had already marched, fought, and dug for. The legionary's toolkit mattered as much as his sword, because it allowed the army to shape terrain instead of being constrained by it. Roads were not just supply routes, they were control, straight, drained, graded. A Roman road did not meander to avoid difficulty, it cut through it. Once built, it remained. Movement became predictable. Supply became reliable. An army that could move the same distance every day could plan weeks ahead. An enemy that could not was always reacting. Depots extended reach. Grain stored ahead of the march reduced dependence on local harvests. Standard rations meant commanders knew exactly how long an army could operate without resupply. Bread, grain, salt, vinegar, not luxury. Consistency. A legion could lose a battle and still function. It could retreat in order, rebuild, resupply, return. This is what Rome's enemies often misunderstood. They measured strength in men. Rome measured it in endurance. When one army was destroyed, Rome raised another. Not by improvisation, but by system. Recruitment pipelines, training standards, equipment production. Losses did not end campaigns. They delayed them. The legion remembered. Tactics that failed were recorded. Routes that worked were reused. Forts became permanent settlements. Roads became arteries of empire. What began as military infrastructure became civil infrastructure. Bridges served trade. Roads connected cities. Dams and canals stabilized agriculture. The same system that moved legions also moved grain, tax, and law. Rome did not conquer by annihilating everyone it fought. It conquered by staying, by returning the next season. And the next, and the next. An enemy could win a battle. Rome could win a decade. This was the difference. The legion was not just a fighting force. It was a mobile state. It built what it needed. It carried what it needed. It remembered what worked. Logistics was not a supporting function. It was the weapon. The ledger records the machine. Not the consul, not the general, not the emperor. The system. When systems rot. The phalanx did not disappear because it was weak. It disappeared because the world it required no longer existed. Perfect ground, perfect cohesion, perfect discipline. Those conditions grew rare. Rome's legion did not overthrow the phalanx by meeting it head-on everywhere. It dismantled it where discipline could not be maintained, where terrain fractured order, where leadership failed to enforce the system. But even Rome would learn the same lesson. Supremacy does not vanish all at once. It erodes. The Roman system reached its height not when it conquered, but when it administered. Roads built, borders stabilized, taxes collected. Armies stationed more often than deployed. Victory became routine. Routine bred assumption. Over time, command shifted. Governorships replaced campaigns. Political favor replaced experience. Appointments were granted for loyalty, not competence. Legions were still formidable. The system remained intact, but pressure was misread. In the forests east of the Rhine, Rome believed it was pacifying territory, collecting tribute, extending administration. In reality, it was overextended. In the year 9 of the Common Era, 3 legions marched into unfamiliar ground under Publius Quinctilius Varus. The terrain was narrow, the roads incomplete, supply lines thin. The legions moved as if resistance would be symbolic. It was not. What followed in the Teutoburg forest was not a single battle, but a sustained collapse. Columns stretched, formations dissolved, rain turned paths into traps. Germanic warbands led by Arminius did not confront the legions in open field. They harassed, they isolated, they struck where cohesion failed. This was not superior equipment, it was superior patience. The Roman legions were not defeated by a better formation. They were defeated by assumptions that the enemy would meet them, that roads would hold, that loyalty could be purchased, that intimidation was enough. Corruption mattered. Funds meant for infrastructure were diverted. Auxiliaries were underpaid. Warnings were ignored. Varus was not an incompetent administrator. He was a poor general placed in a military role. That distinction mattered. Legions fought as trained. They built camps. They tried to regroup. But the system they relied on required time, space, and order. The forest provided none. 3 legions were erased. Rome did not fall that day, but it stopped expanding north. Supremacy does not fail only when confronted by a better weapon. It fails when leadership mistakes administration for control. The phalanx had required discipline enforced by culture. Rome required discipline enforced by institution. When institutions rot, systems fail even if soldiers remain brave. This is the pattern the ledger records. The greatest armies are rarely destroyed by frontal defeat. They are undone by complacency, misalignment, and the belief that yesterday's solution will still apply tomorrow. Rome adapted again. Borders hardened, expansion slowed, containment replaced conquest. But something had changed. The system still worked. It simply refused to chase every pressure. And beyond the frontier, a different kind of supremacy was forming. That did not rely on roads, or camps, or fixed supply. One that thrived on space itself. That chapter opens next. Seven. Supremacy without contact, the horse archer. The legion had solved the problem of the phalanx. It had not solved the problem of space. On open ground, with no narrow pass, no marsh, no city wall, the assumptions that sustained heavy infantry collapsed. What happens when the enemy refuses to stand and fight? What happens when the enemy can strike, withdraw, and strike again, and your formation cannot close? The answer had existed for centuries. The composite bow. The horse. A doctrine built on motion. Long before Rome marched east, the steppe had produced a different solution to war. Scythians harried settled empires from the Eurasian grasslands for generations. They did not seek decisive battle. They sought exhaustion. Strike, withdraw, feigned retreat, return when pursuit broke cohesion. The shot fired backward from the saddle became emblematic. We still call it the Parthian shot. The Parthians inherited and refined this system. They did not conquer cities easily. They bled armies dry. In 53, before the Common Era, Rome learned this lesson the hard way. 7 legions marched east under Marcus Licinius Crassus. Heavy infantry, cohorts, standards raised. Crassus had been advised to march through Armenia, where broken terrain favored infantry. He chose speed instead. Through Mesopotamia, through open ground, through desert. At Battle of Carrhae, the Parthian general Sumer did not offer a line to break. He offered distance, horse archers in constant motion, arrows delivered faster than shields could respond, camel trains carrying endless supply. The Romans formed testudo. They advanced. They halted. They tried again. They never reached contact. The Parthians controlled space. Rome controlled cities. Space won. Carrhae was not an anomaly. It was a boundary. Rome adapted afterward. More cavalry, stronger borders, defensive depth. But it never solved the problem of space on the enemy's terms. That problem would reach its final, perfected form on the Mongolian steppe. The Mongol apex. What the Parthians demonstrated, the Mongols perfected. The steppe did not produce armies by accident. It produced them by necessity. Life on horseback was not training for war. It was survival. Every Mongol male was a rider from childhood. Every rider was an archer. Every archer carried multiple bows tuned for different ranges. This was not specialization. It was baseline competence. Under Genghis Khan, this latent capacity became a system. The Mongol army was not tribal chaos. It was structured, decimal organization, units of tens, hundreds, thousands, command enforced through loyalty and terror, orders transmitted by flags, horns, riders, discipline enforced ruthlessly. The Mongols did not seek battle. They shaped it. They scouted relentlessly. They mapped terrain. They learned supply routes, water sources, seasonal patterns. When they fought asymmetrically. Feigned retreats drew enemies out of formation. Encirclement followed. Arrow storms collapsed morale long before swords mattered. Cities fell not to assault first, but to isolation, supply cut, relief destroyed in the field. The Mongols conquered not because they were unbeatable tactically, but because they never allowed enemies to fight the war they preferred. China, Persia, the Abbasid Caliphate, Eastern Europe, different cultures, same outcome. Supremacy without contact ruled for generations. Why this system lasted so long? Horse archer supremacy endured because it attacked every settled empire's weakness at once. It required no roads, no depots, no fixed bases. Horses grazed as they moved, armies dispersed and reassembled at will. Logistics followed motion, not infrastructure. Where Rome built to advance, the Mongols advanced to survive. This was not merely speed. It was strategic elasticity. Empires could win battles. They could not force conclusions. The halt, not the defeat. Horse archer supremacy did not end because a better system replaced it. It ended where conditions changed. In 1260, in the Levant, the Mongols met something they did not expect. At Battle of Ain Jalut, the Mamluk Sultanate confronted them. The Mamluks were not peasants. They were professional warrior slaves, trained from youth, expert horsemen, skilled archers. They fought mounted, but with discipline learned from settled states. At Ain Jalut, terrain mattered. Hills, narrow approaches, limited maneuver space. The Mongols could not fully deploy their mobility. Their command structure was fractured by succession crisis. The Mamluks forced contact, then pressed. The Mongols withdrew, not everywhere, not permanently, but for the first time, horse archer supremacy was contained. The Mamluks ruled Egypt and the Levant for over 2.5 centuries. They did not conquer the world. They defended it. They were eventually defeated in 1517 by the Ottomans. Gunpowder, artillery. Much later, in 1798, they faced Napoleon. Not as a global power, but as a regional force. They did not stop him. They were already obsolete. The system that had once halted the Mongols had itself aged out. The pattern. Recorded horse archers did not defeat Rome everywhere. They defined the edge of where Rome's system worked. The Mongols did not conquer forever. They conquered until conditions changed. Supremacy migrates not to the strongest army, but to the system that best matches space, economy, and pressure. The steppe ruled while space mattered most. It fell when firepower and fortification changed the equation. The ledger records this not as triumph or tragedy, but as inevitability. The next system will not ride. It will fire, and it will demand something new again. 8. Ledger close. The ledger does not end with horse archers. It pauses, because after this point, supremacy no longer moves in a straight line. The collapse of empire fractures authority, and when authority fragments, warfare fragments with it. The next era is not defined by one dominant system, but by many regional answers to the same pressure. How to strike faster than a kingdom can respond. How to project violence without a permanent army. How to win without controlling territory. From the sea, Viking raiders will answer that pressure with arrival. Shallow drafted ships, river access, and strikes that land before defenses exist. On land, mounted shock will persist where firearms are rare. Polish hussars will perfect cavalry charge long after infantry believes it has solved the problem. In mountains and valleys, disciplined mercenaries will sell cohesion itself. Swiss pikes will break knights. Professional armies will exist before modern states can afford them. In isolated systems, loyalty will become the weapon. Samurai will preserve discipline across generations, even as the world changes around them. None of these systems will dominate everywhere. Each will rule only where conditions allow. This is the pre-gunpowder world, an era of fragmented supremacy, of speed without states, of discipline without permanence, and beneath it all, a pressure building quietly. Because gunpowder is coming, and when it arrives, it will not replace these systems. It will make them irrelevant. That is the next entry. This record is not an opinion. It is not a tribute, and it is not a celebration. It is a ledger. If you are still here, you already understand why these systems mattered and why they failed. New entries will be added, old assumptions will be tested, no heroes will be preserved. If you want to follow the ledger as it grows, you know what to do. This entry is closed. The ledger remains open.